One of the first great revelations of God comes in the book of Exodus, when Moses asks him who he is, when he encounters him in the burning bush, and God says, "I am." One of his first definitive statements about himself isn't merely that he exists, but that he is existence itself. He is being, and all others who exist derive their existence from him. God is. The one response that is immediately dispelled from this great revelation of God is a relativistic attitude towards God and towards religion. Relativism is this idea that you and I, that we create our own truths and our own reality. And that is a seductive bit of wishful thinking, because who doesn't want to be the master of their own reality? Pope Benedict called this the dictatorship of relativism. And it's a dictatorship because it enslaves us to our own emotions and desires. Without some objective, moral, and rational standard to conform our lives to, we become the sum of our appetites. And the proliferation of addiction in humanity is the unavoidable refrain of this truth. In the same way that God is, in spite of our preferences, Catholicism, which is his message of love to the world, is also something that exists objectively. It is well defined through a considerable amount of defining documentation. What Catholicism isn't is whatever we say it is because we merely happen to be Catholic. You and I don't define what it is, and we don't try to conform Catholicism to ourselves any more than we try to conform God to ourselves. We conform ourselves to God and to it. Anything else would be to try to put ourselves in the place of God. And that's what's at the heart of this instinct to try to define God or reality or our lives on our own terms. That's the essential sin of Adam and Eve, who wanted to set up on their own and be like God. And that's what convinced them to eat the fruit. So with that said, I wanted to read something from some of that considerable documentation that defines what Catholicism is. It comes from Pope Pius XI's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, because there are a lot of Catholics out there who are trying to reassure themselves that certain ideas are easily reconcilable with Catholicism when they are not. So here's what he says. Socialism, if it remains truly socialism, cannot be reconciled with the teachings of the Catholic Church, because its concept of society itself is utterly foreign to Christian truth. And then he goes on to say, religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. And whenever I produce documentation like this, people always respond by saying something like, well, that's just a peculiarity to this particular pope and not necessarily part of the tradition of the church. And in the case of Quadragesimo Anno, that's simply not true. It was actually published on the 40th anniversary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which said very similar things concerning socialism. And there are countless declarations by other popes that say the exact same thing. Now, why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because it addresses a systemic problem in the church today, which is this idea that Catholicism is incomplete. That Catholicism only addresses a narrow range of ideas about God, and that anything else of consequence is up to us to figure out, and it's usually figured out and based on some ideological affiliation. So you get people describing themselves as Catholic socialists or Catholic libertarians or pro-choice Catholics or whatever. I call this the Catholic and phenomenon, where it's not enough to simply describe yourself as Catholic. We've become convinced that there are still blanks that need to be filled in. But this has two fundamental problems. The first is that many of these ideological persuasions that we like to saddle our Catholicism with have been explicitly denounced as intrinsically incompatible with the Catholic faith. As we just heard from that excerpt, socialism is one such example, but I know a lot of people who call themselves Catholic socialists. The second problem is that the word Catholic means according to the whole, and you might have heard it's more commonly translated as universal, but the problem with that word is that it introduces a whole bunch of associations and concepts that aren't compatible with the Catholic faith, like universalism. So I prefer according to the whole because it isolates the fact that Catholicism is about the whole truth. It isn't constrained to some small aspect of truth. It's a complete system of thought, which is why it doesn't need to have all these ideological appendages attached to it according to the whims of individual Catholics. And if that's true, then when it comes to matters of consequence, we shouldn't have to raid the pantry of other ideological creeds to have a fully fleshed out system of thought. Catholicism may have an intellectual tradition that is neglected, but it is certainly not incapable of answering our questions. Rerum Novarum, for example, is Pope Leo XIII's encyclical about how justice can be achieved between the working class and the capitals of industry. So you don't need to turn to Marxism to answer that question. It's been addressed for us as Catholics, and so there's no need to turn to socialism or to call yourself a Catholic socialist. And this is true for a whole range of questions and topics. Now, obviously, Catholicism doesn't address every single question about how to live our lives. It leaves quite a bit open to interpretation while providing us with a framework that we can live our lives within. But over the course of 2,000 years of thinking and writing about the topics that have captured people's interest, the magisterium of the church has covered a lot of ground, so there's no reason to be dragging condemned ideologies within the sanctuary of the church. They belong outside the church and outside the limits of our assent. This is also why we should have very little use for qualifying our Catholicism. You're not a liberal Catholic or a conservative Catholic. You're a Catholic. You either accept the whole thing according to the whole or none of it. It doesn't really leave us open to any other options. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.